Well, I'm going to stand up here and, yes, we're ready to go. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here to part 2 of First Unitarian Society's Protecting Minnesota Waters presentation. Last week we had a really wonderful conversation with Steve Ring of the Sierra Club, and heard some good background information that I think is going to help us further the conversation today, and that set us up well to frame what we're going to hear today. I'm Reverend Kelly Clement. I serve this congregation as assistant minister and with social justice in my portfolio. So I have the great joy of working with our Active Voices and Climate Action team folks, and I want to issue an invitation to anyone within the sound of my voice who is interested in joining the work of our mighty Active Voices and Climate Action team people. You only need to reach out to one of the people who has their hand raised as a member of those teams. There we go. If you're interested, raise your hand. So it is a great pleasure to welcome here Peter Wagenius. As you are the Sierra Club North Star Chapter Legislative and Political Director, correct? Yep. And known to some of us by your last name. Yeah. I have to say that I was so proud to vote for Gene Wagenius as my representative for many, many years. I was a proud constituent, and your mom and I was in seminary with your dad. So, yeah, so Dwight, so really give them warm regards from the people here, and in your own right. You don't have to be somebody's son to be welcome here, and really grateful to have your expertise as you tell us, we hope, what we can look for in this coming legislative session. We know you've got some good things to tell us. We'll do about 30 minutes-ish, and then we'll do some Q&A. Folks online, please feel free to chat your questions, and people in the room, hold your questions until we get to the Q&A, and we'll get through all of those, and we'll do our best to end pretty close to 1 o'clock. So thank you so much, and we're delighted to welcome you here. Peter Wagenius.
No problem. All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Yes. In a moment, I'm going to share a little bit of my history, which led me to Sierra Club, but a question first. How many of you at any point in your lives have lived in the city of Minneapolis? Okay, fantastic. And St. Paul? Okay, that's great. That'll be relevant later because a portion of my career was working for the mayor of Minneapolis for 16 years, and it informs my work now at the Capitol. Right after the end of the 2023 legislative session, some of our best climate champions in the Minnesota House of Representatives approached me and some of my colleagues. They said, you know, some of our younger colleagues, they are getting heavily lobbied by industry on some so-called climate solutions, which we believe are fake, delaying tactics meant to extend fossil fuels. And these legislators, together with me, Sarah Wolf from Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, and a couple of other advocates, worked to develop a presentation for those legislators on how to spot real versus fake climate solutions. I hope to share a short conversation about that at the end of the presentation, but first we're just going to dive into a case study on one particular sector, the transportation sector, a case study in real versus fake climate solutions. In Minnesota, the number one source of climate pollution is the transportation sector. Here's a breakdown, you'll see on this slide, of where climate pollution comes from different sectors in Minnesota. This one is a few years old, but it hasn't changed too much. I like this format because I think it's really easy to read. The number one source of climate emissions is on the left, that's transportation. Second is electricity, third is agriculture, and so on. Electricity generation was already number 2, and it was already falling last year when the legislature did an amazing thing. They passed the 100% clean electricity bill by 2040. I'm just going to interject here for a moment, and maybe I'm channeling my father, but I have never felt more hopeful as an American when Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act and all the climate provisions in it, which told me for the first time that as a nation, we might actually do our part to address climate change, more than I've felt that in 30 years of work on this. That hope as an American was matched by my hope as a Minnesotan last year when we passed 3 out of 3 huge climate bills. More work to be done? Absolutely. But when the first of those bills passed, I realized that the trends we were already seeing in electricity generation, we could bring them to warp speed and really bring us to clean electricity by 2040. Transportation is not quite as hopeful a story in Minnesota. Transportation is number 1, and unlike electricity, it's not moving in the right direction. Oops, I lost my cursor. I'll use this. How did that work? There we go. Transportation is not moving in the right direction. Here's the reality. There is no data to support the idea that we can address climate pollution from the transportation sector with electrification alone. I'm going to say that again. There is no data to support the idea that we can address climate pollution from the transportation sector with electrification alone. Can't be done. We must also reduce vehicle miles traveled. Cars, even before electrification, have actually been getting a lot less polluting. And the efficiencies of those cars have been obliterated by the fact that we've been driving them so many more miles than we used to. This is nothing against electric cars. This is my family's Chevy Bolt at my parents' farm. But too many people think electric cars will solve all problems. This is how the conversation looks oftentimes. Electric cars gets all the attention, and everything else we need to do gets very little attention. But we have a model we can look to in the area of solid waste. We all learned the 3 R's. Somebody tell me the 3 R's. What are the 3 R's? Reduce, reuse, recycle. And a key piece of understanding the 3 R's is it's not a random list. We don't say recycle, reuse, reduce because we understand the first one is the best one. The second one is what you do if you can't do the first, and the third is what you do if you can't do the first or second. Reduce, reuse, recycle is not a random list. It is a prioritized order. In transportation, we have the same thing. Our first goal should be reduce vehicle miles traveled. Why? Because the least polluting miles anyone has to, that exists are the miles you don't have to drive at all because you have alternatives, or because the places you want to get to are closer to you than they used to be. Number 2, electrify. Electricity is far superior to any available liquid fuels because of both the greater use of solar and wind for electricity and also the inherent efficiency of electric engines, which deliver far more of the power to driving as opposed to in internal combustion engines where a huge amount of the energy is lost as waste heat. Lower carbon fuels should be in the 3rd category. If there is a mile we can't reduce, if there's a mile we can't electrify, then we should look at lowering the carbon intensity of liquid fuels in trucks, in construction equipment, where electrification is not an option. Again, the key here is this is a prioritized order. We reduce the miles we can. If we can't reduce those miles, we electrify those miles. If we can't do either one or two, we should try to reduce the carbon intensity of liquid fuels until electricity is ready to power all vehicles. Why do I emphasize this so much? Because there are people at the Capitol, and there are certainly people in industries, like in the ethanol industry, who have this order exactly upside down. I've been working on transportation policy for over 2 decades now, and I'd like to share some of my background, but also to show you what I've learned about transportation policy. A little background about me. My father's family is from western central Minnesota near the Kensington Runestone. Anybody know about the Kensington Runestone? My grandfather said, "I know the Kensington Runestone is real because I know the guy who wrote it." He did, Olaf Oman. I grew up in Minneapolis. I later went to college in Northfield. Today, my wife and I live in Minneapolis with our daughters. They are 10 and 6. They both play soccer, which means I've been informed by an older parent in the neighborhood that I've now entered the double chauffeur phase of life. This is my favorite chauffeuring vehicle. I had a transformative experience during my junior year in college when I got to visit Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Cancer Alley is a place where 3 groups are tightly put together: polluting petrochemical facilities, refineries that produce gasoline for cars, people of color, and cancer, and many other health impacts. It's an environmental racism atrocity. I had written a paper on environmental racism and also ended up guest teaching about environmental justice to a high school class in New Orleans. I want to be clear, I was definitely not the most qualified person to teach on this at the age of 20-something. Dr. Robert Bullard had published his landmark book, Dumping in Dixie to refer to the American South, the year before. But he wasn't available to teach in my brother's junior high school class. I was. My paper on environmental racism was subsequently sent by my professor to his former colleague, United States Senator Paul Wellstone, then in his second year in office. Wellstone, according to my professor, used my paper to help him advocate for the creation of the Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, I'm under no illusions that my paper was pivotal to Wellstone's work, but just the idea that that was possible, that someone could get the right words to the right decision maker to make a real difference in people's lives, I was down for that mission from that point forward. I was already hooked on making change through political campaigns, thanks to having worked on my mother's political campaigns, but now the synergy of electoral and legislative change coalesced for me. Here's another thing I learned in college. Metropolitan sprawl is bad for the environment. When we use bulldozers and heavily subsidized highways to destroy natural spaces that provide habitat and sequester carbon in plants and soils, and develop those lands into super low density housing patterns that are designed to be hostile to walking, to biking, to transit, that's really bad for the environment in 10 different ways, and I've only given you a couple. After college, I worked at an educational theater for children, teaching conflict resolution and behavioral skills to both mainstream kids and kids with behavioral challenges. Turns out that's a great preparation for my next job at the state legislature. In the late 90s, not today. It's totally different today. Here's something else I learned while I was in the legislature. It was in the late 90s that people first documented that where people live makes a huge impact on how much they contribute to the climate crisis. People living in denser areas pollute a lot less per capita than people who don't. There's a long list of factors, including driving distances, access to transit, heating and cooling efficiencies of multifamily housing, and you can imagine when people are further apart, there's a greater carbon intensity to providing the infrastructure that connects them. This is the Chicago area. The old way of thinking was to ask, where are people polluting? And that's on the left-hand side of the map. But then they asked the question, how much are people polluting per capita? And the picture reverses. It literally reverses. You can imagine why. So, and imagine its effect on the natural world. Both of these maps show an island housing 100 housing units. The left one is 100 houses. The one on the right is an apartment building with 100 homes. Which one preserves natural land better? The one on the left, 100% of the island is used. The one on the right, 4% of the island is used. The New York Times, just last December, did this exercise for everyone. Everyone in America can look up where they live and see the climate impact of their neighborhood mapped. This is the Twin Cities area focused in close. And it's the same story everywhere. There's no judgment, by the way, in my earlier question about where you live. Minneapolis is just a great example of an international phenomenon, a particularly bad phenomenon in America. And let me tell you, what they quantified in the turn of the century was a challenge to typical environmental thinking, including at Sierra Club. Think about the history of Sierra Club. It was founded on the idea that this is environmentalism. Living at Thoreau's house in the woods in Walden Pond was considered the environmental ideal. Worse, the environmental movement was historically anti-urban. That is a history that Sierra Club has struggled with, including its founder. But today, to address the climate crisis, we must recognize that environmentalism in housing looks less like this and more like this. Multifamily housing near transit, near parks. We still value green space, but not the idea that everybody has a unique, large chunk of it, but that we figure out ways to share it. This is environmentalism in housing. This is the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis, which is a leading nationwide example, not of transit-oriented development, but of bicycle-oriented development, because people want to live next to this. And I'll tell you, there's a generational thing at work here. I find that people in my generation, I'm 53, and people of my parents' generation in between, we define freedom differently than younger generations. We define freedom as having a car and having enough money to fill the gas tank to go wherever we want to go. Younger generations define freedom as not being burdened with owning a car and can get everywhere they want to be without having to own a car because they want to stay connected through what they consider to be their freedom of connection with the world through the internet. Dense housing, efficient to heat and cool, located to facilitate choices for how to get around, including walking, biking, and transit, and by bus and by train, and by future electric and driverless buses. This is part of our climate future. Thanks to what they quantified in Chicago and have documented with increasing frequency ever since, I went to City Hall with Mayor Ryback in 2002 knowing the following: any answer to the climate crisis must include welcoming more people to live in equitable and sustainable cities. When I was a kid, people talked about the death of cities. Cities all over the nation had been declining in population in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and some into their 90s. And then cities like Minneapolis started to turn it around. Particularly for the older cities, it's really just math. Average household size in 1950 was 3.51. Average household size, 3.51. The family that lived in my parents' house in South Minneapolis before we moved in had 4 kids. Our family had 2 kids. Multiply that all around the region, and you realize that just to have maintained their existing populations, cities would have had to build a lot more housing units. It's just math. If the number of people per household declines, the number of households needs to increase in order to accommodate everybody. It's just math. But we weren't allowing that in Minneapolis or in cities around the country. We actually went the other direction. We tore down housing in the 1960s as a part of urban renewal. We tore down housing to accommodate freeways instead of allowing the housing that was needed. And the death of cities was a real threat. Minneapolis population in 1950 was 521,000. By 1990, it had dropped to 368,000. That's certainly the biggest total drop and the biggest percentage drop in Minnesota. It wasn't the only city. There were about 20 cities in the metropolitan area, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and first-ring suburbs, that declined in population. Not as drastically as this, but declined. And then they started to rebound. Minneapolis is now back up to 429,000. But you'll see, we are still, in Minneapolis, 92,000 people less than our peak. You know what I've never heard? I've never heard people say, Minneapolis was a terrible place to live in the 1950s. Certainly, for people of color, it wasn't an equitable place to live. But I haven't heard people say that there was something inherently bad about there being that number of people in the city of Minneapolis. So we're on our way back. We're growing, but we're not where we were before. We're still 18.5% less than our peak population. And again, it's because of household size. Lest anyone doubt that land use reforms could make a huge difference for the climate, this is a slide from MnDOT, the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And let me tell you, I've been fighting MnDOT my whole life. MnDOT really wants to believe that Our climate polluting land use and transportation policies are the result of individual choices and not public policy. So it was breathtaking for them to acknowledge that there's a lot we can do, and the biggest by far climate impact we could have is second from bottom, land use patterns. See how much more dots there are there? Sorry, this is a small slide, but they believe, the Met Council believes, the University of Minnesota believes, the University of Wisconsin believes that changing land use patterns are the single biggest thing we could do to reduce transportation emissions. By far. And they don't even include parking policy. You add parking policy to land use patterns, you put those together, and you're really reducing emissions. By the way, this is overwhelmingly a metropolitan problem. This is our response. The metro area is where VMT has been increasing drastically. I like to tell people, metro area, when it comes to land use and transportation policy, the metro area is the source of the problem. It's also the source of the solution. Greater Minnesota is not doing this. Greater Minnesota has been flat in terms of vehicle miles traveled. But in the metro area, it's been drastically increasing. So let me tell you about 2023 and 2024. This is timing out pretty well. 2023 was a wonderful session. I told you that we passed 3 amazing climate bills. The first one was 100% clean electricity by 2040. We're going to get so much faster towards clean electricity because of that bill. And we have now joined 11 states. There are only 11 states with 100% clean energy policy. And a lot of them are by 2050. Ours is by 2040. So we've gone from doing virtually nothing to being in the top 5 or 6 in the nation. We also passed, thanks to the state representative and state senator who represent this building, Representative Frank Hornstein and State Senator Scott Dibble, passed an omnibus transportation bill that quadrupled funding for transit in this region. This is a bill I've wanted my entire life. It's going to allow for a huge expansion of bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit is in its highest form, it's like light rail transit, but on rubber tires. It has been hugely successful in this region. We replaced a couple of old bus lines in North Minneapolis on Penn Avenue and on Emerson Fremont, and we now have one in South Minneapolis and Chicago. The first 2 arterial bus rapid transit lines increased, in their first year of operations, increased transit ridership by 20%, and this new one has more like 80%. Huge increases and really affordable, such that we can spread it all around the metro area. I could give you a longer presentation. I have many more slides about this, but I want to make sure we have time for questions. But it works. And it works especially when you can connect it to housing. I live along the central corridor line between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul, and there's a huge wave of development. I live in Prospect Park, where the LRT line is inspiring people to live next to the LRT line. And you get from that huge reductions in emissions. But that's not all the omnibus transportation bill did. It funded an expansion of both arterial bus rapid transit, highway bus rapid transit. There's a credit for people to buy e-bikes. Electric bikes have, the highest number of people buying electric bikes are people over 60. Because it suddenly allows people to do things physically that they maybe haven't been able to do for a long time or were afraid to do. There's a credit for electric vehicles that we're working on. It's a huge bill. But according, again, to the University of Minnesota, the University of Wisconsin, that's just a key to opening the door. The real key is to bring the city of Minneapolis population back up to what it was in 1950. Because if you calculate that 92,000 people, plus all the other 11 cities in the metro area that are underneath their peak population, it's 126,000 people. What if 126,000 people, instead of being able to live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and those first-string suburbs that all decline in population, what if 126,000 people need housing that requires us to use bulldozers to knock down green space, to build housing at the periphery of the region? There's a huge difference in how much 126,000 people pollute. in these communities where the infrastructure already exists, as opposed to at the periphery of the region where none of that infrastructure exists and has to be built from scratch. So let me end on this point. I told you that the legislators asked us, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, Sierra Club, Clean Up the River Environment, Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, they asked us to present on real versus fake climate solutions. We didn't just want to tell them what was real and what was fake. We wanted to arm them with asking the right questions so they could figure out for themselves, as new ideas came forward, what's real and what's fake. And we started out with 20 questions, got down to 8. We got down to these 5 key questions that you need to ask of anything somebody is bringing to you as a legislator to say, this is a solution to the climate. Number 1, what percentage of climate pollution is reduced or added? The key word here is percentage, because IPC climate science tells us, International Panel on Climate Science on climate change tells us, we don't need to reduce pollution marginally. We need to, if we want to stabilize the climate at any higher temperature, we have to eliminate pollution from multiple sectors of the economy. So when somebody says, oh, this is going to reduce pollution, it's the equivalent of taking X number of cars off the road, that always sounds impressive. But my mother was being presented in her last couple of terms in office with a proposal that we're going to increase the efficiency of low-income housing. And my mother asked the person, okay, with your available funding, how long till you get to 100% of the needed housing? They didn't want to answer the question. He says, well, that's the goal. The goal is to do all of the housing. And when they ran the math, it was like 250 years. And she said, we don't have 250 years. Using the word percentage helps to remind people we have a goal we have to hit to stabilize the climate. Question number 2. Someone's bringing a climate solution. Can this technology exist in our zero emissions future, or is it a dead-end pathway? The industry will tell you that natural gas, methane gas, fossil gas is less polluting than coal. Sure, wow, that's a low bar. Less polluting than coal. That's not the objective. The objective is to stop polluting. Investments in more natural gas infrastructure is a dead-end pathway. We're going to be electrifying heat. You're going to hear at the legislature this year a push for a new clean heat proposal, which will gradually electrify heat. My parents electrified heat at their home. That's something we can do. Investing in that is investing in a zero emissions future. Anything that extends the network of natural gas pipelines is a dead-end pathway. It can't get where we need to go. Number 3, are there better alternatives? We talked about this a little bit. We know what better alternatives exist in transportation. Reduce vehicle miles traveled, including through land use reforms. Electrify every mile you can, and for everything else that we can't electrify yet, let's reduce the carbon intensity of liquid fuels. You're going to hear at the Capitol this year, you know what we need to address emissions in the transportation sector? More ethanol. This is one of these places where, and we were talking about this, on the phone in anticipation of this. 15, 20 years ago, environmental organizations were advocating for more ethanol. We need to forgive each other for our previous understanding and just recognize and embrace new information. When we learn what's true, we need to just embrace what's true. The people who are advocating for more ethanol were making an argument in favor of let's reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Okay, that's a good goal, and that seemed to resonate with people, so we use that argument. But that's not the same as reducing your dependence on oil. Reducing your dependence on foreign oil is not the same as reducing your dependence on oil. And it turns out the best way to reduce your dependence on foreign oil is to reduce your dependence on oil. And now we have the tools. The reduction in price of solar, wind, batteries is breathtaking. We didn't know that 15, 20 years ago. We didn't know. But we know it now, and we need to forgive our previous selves and just act on new information. So when you hear somebody say, We want to pass a low-carbon fuel standard that will marginally reduce the carbon intensity of liquid fuels, and it's going to lead to an expansion of biofuels. Remember that they conned us. They conned us. Some of the same people who were telling my mother, we need more ethanol, they were denying the existence of climate change in the same week, in the same day, in another room, in another hearing, across the hall at the state capitol. Number 4, what are the other impacts, both good and bad? This is where environmental justice comes in. Remember that slide I showed you of Cancer Alley? When we fill our tanks, we're contributing to that. Same thing is true of ethanol. All across southern Minnesota, family farms are subjected to nitrate pollution. It's really unsafe for pregnant women and their kids to drink water that has nitrate pollution in it. And where nitrate pollution exists, pesticide pollution always goes along with it from corporate row crop agriculture. I'll leave you with this thought, and then we'll take questions. Why have we managed last year to pass all this great climate legislation? One reason is because we elected legislators who were ready to do it. But another reason is because of who influences climate policy in Minnesota. We don't produce oil from Minnesota. We don't produce coal. We don't produce natural gas. But we do produce ethanol. We export ethanol, and we try to export the lie that ethanol is a climate solution. We need to let that go. Which brings me to number 5. Who benefits from this? Who loses? Who pays? It's always right to ask these questions. And when the beneficiary is attempting to, of a particular policy, is attempting to extend the life of the business plan for big ag and big oil, who have been making our climate worse, we should be skeptical. So, I went a little long. I'm sure you have questions. Marcy.
There's a question on the chat.
Hang on a second. Hang on, I'm going to get you on the microphone. But first, thank you, Peter. Wow. So much good information. And before we do the questions, I just want to say, I want to do 2 things. One is, out in the hallway in the back is our action for the day. There are postcards for you to sign that are about Minnesota water. So when you go out the door here, you can do that. And online, you've received a link in the chat for our current action. My second question, or my second thing is, Peter, can we have access to your slide deck?
Yep.
Great. So if anybody wants access to that, let me know. You can find me online. I see you back there, Phil. Let's get this online question first.
There is a question on the chat, and the question is, please talk about the challenges to Minneapolis 2040 plan and how it relates to today's topics.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the City of Minneapolis passed the 2040 plan about 5 years ago now, and that plan was based on the realizations we have starting from Chicago in the 1990s up to today, that we need to allow more people to live in the city of Minneapolis. It allowed people to a range of changes, including allowing people to turn a garage into an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU. Has anybody heard of an ADU before? Sometimes they're called granny flats or mother-in-law apartments. They used to be legal all around the country, by the way. It's not new. Sometimes we discover the wisdom of our elders, and it's like, okay, that's life cycle housing. All the way up to allowing significantly greater densities along transit corridors. I'll just give you an example in my neighborhood. In my neighborhood, there were some older residents of the neighborhood, including an architect named Dick Gilliard, and he said, I live in a single-family home. By the way, I live in a single-family home. Okay? There's no judgment in any of these questions. These are data points that we can act on. And Dick Gilliard said to the neighborhood, as we were debating, should we support the Green Line coming through our neighborhood to between the downtowns, and later when we were discussing housing along the corridor, he said, you know, someday I'm not going to be able to live in my house anymore. I'd still love to live in Prospect Park. So we should support what now exists. There's a development on University Avenue. It's called The Pillars. It's a senior living facility. And all the parents of the kids I went to South High School with, when they cycle out of their homes, in their single-family homes, they can now live in the neighborhood. They can still walk to see their friends. They can still participate in every way in the life of their community because we made legal something which was previously illegal. Legalizing housing is what we're talking about in the 2040 plan. And there was a lawsuit filed against the 2040 plan, which has basically put it in legal limbo for multiple years now. And the people supporting that, some of them are genuinely motivated by the environment and misinformed about the data, and some of them are just NIMBYs. I don't want more people to live in the city of Minneapolis. I want to honor the fact that people come to these conclusions from multiple perspectives, sometimes good faith concerns and sometimes bad faith issues. But the bottom line is policies like 2040 have to pass. There is no solution to the climate crisis that doesn't include allowing more people to live in places like Minneapolis, at least as many as used to live here, because the alternative, when you don't allow building up, you end up building out into turning cornfields into the least efficient housing ever. So I don't know what's going to happen with 2040. It's going to be a subject at the legislature this year. But my hope is that we can recognize what we know to be true, honor the fact that people are reasonably sometimes afraid of change, but try to embrace a future of true life cycle housing where people shouldn't have to, and it's not just Minneapolis, people shouldn't have to move away from their communities. Your children should be able to afford to live in the communities they grew up in, and the housing crisis around the country is showing us that they can't.
Yeah. I've got one right back here, and then I'll come to you, Kate.
Yes, this may not be in your domain, but I'll ask it anyway. I'd like to have you address what is the role of population growth regarding pollution?
Yeah, that's a great question. Climate pollution overwhelmingly comes from consumption. And if you want to think about it as a mathematical formula, population times consumption equals the number of emissions you get. Most of the time when people have engaged in the conversation about population, like with Paul Ehrlich back in the 60s, it went to a very bad place very quickly. And frankly, a fact-free sort of place. People would look at the population of the continent of Africa and be concerned. Africa as a continent is responsible for like 4% of global pollution because overwhelmingly wealth is the biggest indicator of how much people pollute.
Yes.
It's wealth. It's not the total number of people. It's, how much people fly. It's how much space do they consume? How much products do they consume? Population is a factor, but I don't think it's the factor we should be focused on, particularly as Americans, when we pollute so far out of proportion to our population. We should be investing in high population places around the country so as to make sure they can skip over our pattern of development. In America, we went from before the industrial pollution to highly polluting, and now we're trying to get away from it. If we're a generous country, we're helping higher population countries skip over oil and natural gas and coal and go directly to renewables. That's what we should be focused on. I don't think the population discussion leads us anywhere good. We should be helping people around, and I'm speaking for myself here, not necessarily for any organizational, we should be defending the equality of men and of women all around the globe, because that is one of the number one indicators. I mean, in the book Drawdown, the equality of women and girls is one of the best climate solutions on the numbers. When women and girls are equal, they choose. They're not told to. They choose to have smaller families. And again, I'm speaking as an individual here. Sierra Club has such a problematic history on this. They don't like us to talk about it, so I'm telling you what I think. We should embrace the equality of women and girls for its own sake. For its own sake. and also recognize that it will have climate benefits.
Amen to that. Kate.
I'm thinking about the population density and looking forward to increasing population density in urban areas. One of the distinctions between the 1950s, or for that matter, even when I moved here in the early 80s, is that the industry that people are commuting to is no longer central. And so if you move the people without moving the other end of their commute, then you're not going to decrease the number of miles driven, because you still have a long vector.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And part of the way that that we are seeking to address that, and there's a great professor at Rice University who helped to redesign Houston's bus system, is to shift away from the old way of thinking about transit, which was called hub and spoke. You know, everybody goes into the downtown and then they go back out of the downtown. It doesn't reflect how people's commuting patterns today. And smart cities all across the world are moving to a grid system where you can transfer between 2 points and get to a lot of destinations. Part of what the legislature is going to be considering is land use patterns to encourage job growth along transit corridors. We have been doing the opposite for a long time. Those are policy choices. We can change those policy choices. But that's part of why I don't like to draw a distinction as much between urban and suburban. I use the Minneapolis example because it's a stark example. The most crucial difference is the difference between the developed area and the outside the developed area. That's where suburbs aren't going away. I'm not looking to make them go away. But you know what all kinds of suburbs are doing? They're recognizing that a huge number of trips that people take are not to and from their jobs. They're to services, to parks, to libraries. So Burnsville is developed their own downtown. Burnsville, heart of the city. Hopkins downtown. North St. Paul are reinvigorating their Main Street. The West End. All kinds of smart, savvy, suburban policymakers are reducing vehicle miles traveled in their communities by saying, even if people are going to be driving to their jobs, let's not make them drive to the movie theater. Let's not make them drive to the senior centers. Let's not make them drive to the park. Let's not make them drive to the library. The last station on the Orange Line Bus Rapid Transit project that starts in downtown Minneapolis is at Burnsville, heart of the city. So we absolutely need to be aware of what you're talking about and not allow it to, and deal with it and not allow us to assume that it is the only way people travel or the only way we can develop our land use policies. I'll tell you one more thing about, and you'll hear this at the legislature this year, because you're going to hear policies about land use reform, including from your local legislators. Minneapolis as a region, the Twin Cities as a region is growing. But we're not growing at a ridiculous, like Seattle, San Francisco type pace, right? I think we're in the sweet spot. Thank God we are in a sweet spot. If you have followed like industrial cities that are like Detroit that just lose and lose and lose, that's not a situation we ever want to be in. When I came to City Hall, people were still worried about that based on trends in the 60s and 70s. You know what else I don't want to be in? I don't want to be in the position of Seattle or San Francisco, where growth happens, they did no planning for it, and they have affordable housing crisis, people are living on the street. That's not good either. We are in a sweet spot where we can take into account factors like you're talking about and gradually change over the course of our next 10 years to reduce emissions, to reduce inequality, to provide people access to multiple destinations, and not be in either extreme of Detroit or San Francisco.
Thank you. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more questions. Do we have any more online, Marcy? I didn't see any the last time I looked. So.
Thank you very much. So if everything's electrified, that's great. But the problem is, where does that energy come from? In 2011, in Minneapolis, there was a 20-nation conference on algae oil fuel. Algae oil power comes from growing algae that takes in carbon and sunshine. And when you use the lipids, the oil, to run things like the Navy actually uses it because it can work in their jet engines, then you're just putting out the same amount of carbon that you took in from the environment. You're not bringing carbon from the ground. And so I think one of the things we need to do is have a huge national, worldwide effort to do the R&D on algae oil fuel, which is a lot more efficient than any other thing like growing corn, et cetera, things like that.
Thanks for that question.
What's the story on algae oil fuel? Is it anywhere on the horizon?
Well, let me answer the first part of your question and then the second part. Powering a vehicle with electricity today is already way better than a gas-powered car, because our electricity supply already includes a lot of solar and wind, and because there's this other factor that the fossil fuel industry doesn't want you to know about, because electric cars are just so much more efficient. I've got a separate presentation on this. I'll come back and we'll walk through all the other sectors of where pollution comes from. But electricity is already better, and it'll just keep getting better as a source. The key question with technologies like oil from algae is, are they scalable? Algae was something people were really excited about 10, 15 years ago. And I'll tell you some bad news. One of the oil companies that was sponsoring that, which was running one of those programs for like 15 years, just shut it down last year. And the people I trust on climate policy will tell you they shut it down because they realized it was unscalable. And they kind of knew it was unscalable long before they shut it down, but they wanted to be able to say they were working on something. Honestly. We do need to think about, because aviation isn't going to disappear. In Europe, they're actually making short flights illegal to try and reduce the cost of the environmental damage from aviation. We do need to look at, for miles we can't reduce, for miles we can't electrify, we do need to look at reducing the carbon intensity of liquid fuels. I'm encouraged that for some heavy industrial applications, it's possible to create green hydrogen, and I hesitate to mention this because there's so much bad hydrogen out there. And it can be converted into other things that can store electricity. Batteries are just amazing what they're doing, and the cost curves on batteries keep coming down, 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 down. Is that an answer for aviation? It turns out for smaller planes and shorter flights, yes, it is. For 747s, we're going to need reduced carbon intensity liquid fuels until we can build a rail network that allows us to have flights be, international and not within the country. But we can't be distracted when the fossil fuel industry says we're going to scale up some technology they've been working to scale up for 15 years and been unable to do so. So I don't have much hope for algae.
So it's still solar and wind.
And solar and wind, if I shared you the original presentation we talked about, the projections they made on the cost of solar and wind in 2010, 13, 14 years ago, nobody predicted. Even Greenpeace, which was basically just putting a hope on a wall, even they were wrong. The cost of solar, wind, and batteries decreased far more than the most optimistic predictions from 2010. And there's this wonderful study from Oxford which indicates they map that for any given amount of technology adoption, how much the cost curves go down. They predict that solar, wind, and batteries are going to keep going down. And when we add a fourth technology, which is truly green hydrogen production from electrolysis, powered by leftover electricity, for when you have more solar and wind electricity than you can use, that fourth technology is far more likely to be scalable than any of these kind of fossil fuel algae lab stuff.
Okay, we're going to see if we can get through these others fairly quickly.
I should give you shorter answers is the problem, but you ask good questions which require, are harder.
You're doing good. My interest is in the hemp industry and its multiple uses. It can agriculturally be produced at levels that are much better and safer.
I missed the very first thing you
The
said.
hemp industry.
Okay, yep.
And Buckminster Fuller in 1927 actually made a car, the tires, the body, everything, and he fueled it. Everything was made from hemp.
Yep.
And, getting back to this technology, which is very green, I think would be a good solution. Your comments.
I agree. And, people who are on the fake climate solutions thing will look at people like you and people like me, and they will accuse us of being anti-agriculture. You know what? If we want to subsidize agriculture, let's subsidize agriculture. But don't pretend that ethanol is a climate solution. Don't pretend that these historic policies against using products that make sense, crops that make sense like hemp, don't pretend that's based in science. It's based in whatever connections people wanted to make that was threatening to the cotton industry. We have to make decisions based on data, not based on who has political power. And so I agree with you, and corn production is a perfect example. There's a new study from Jason Hill, professor at the University of Minnesota, talking about the true cost of corn. And the amount of money we're putting into ethanol is the equivalent of like 5 of those big counties in southern Minnesota. That's how much land is going just to ethanol production. Has anybody forgotten that agriculture is supposed to be for, what is that thing we make from agriculture? Food? Food. Food, and with hemp, clothing. There are much better solutions when we follow the science rather than the industries.
Okay, Kathleen.
One thing that neither you nor the man last week talked about, the effect of the military, the huge effect of the military on how horrible fossil fuels are for this planet.
That's a great question, and I'll say 2 things about the military. They are a huge user of fossil fuels, and not that I need to defend the military, but they are very concerned about future wars over resources. They are actually, in terms of their influence on foreign policy is not good, but when people on the right end of the political spectrum deny climate change, they are inviting more wars. They're inviting more wars. And I'd like us to not listen to the military or I should say the military contractors, the defense contractors, when they want weapons even the military says we don't need. And I'd also like to not send Americans into wars based on defending oil supplies. It's all interconnected.
That too, not just the right.
Oh, I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
Thanks.
You're right.
All right, I've got one over here, and I got one more over here, and then that'll be, then we'll call it a day. Because we could keep you all out.
Yeah. So I have a question sort of similar to where Rick was on electrifying things. I know a couple of years ago, many years ago, I was doing a website on sustainability in Minneapolis, and I was really struck by an architect who showed me a graph of how electricity loses, as you leave the power plant, how it all disappears by the time it gets to your house. So I'm just wondering, and that was like 8 years ago, I'm wondering if you can say anything more about how we are, like you were talking about batteries and solar, how we are getting better at being able to have the source of electricity be useful in a local place. I don't know.
That's a great question. And again, just like Minnesota's in a sweet spot because our region is in a sweet spot because of we're growing but not growing at an insane pace. We're also in a sweet spot because Minnesota is great for both solar and wind. We do have to, and this is a nationwide challenge. Leah Stokes, Jesse Jenkins, professors who helped President Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, they will tell you that one of the things we need to desperately do quickly in the next 10 years is rapidly expand the electricity delivery system, the grid. Because if we rapidly expand the grid, we're going to be able to take advantage in the Twin Cities of being able to have cleaner and cleaner power faster than anybody else because of how close we are to, Buffalo Ridge or whatever it's called in southwestern Minnesota. I mean, just amazingly good wind power. We have to start that now because the East Coast is not set up for solar and wind. We have to connect the whole country with a modern grid. We have to stop depending on the infrastructure that our parents and grandparents build and start acting like Americans who can build things. That's a big part of our future. In terms of co-location, once we have a really great grid, co-location with solar and wind is going to be less important in terms of like where we live, but it is going to be really important for the hardest to decarbonize sectors. I'm talking about like steel production, cement production. I've had conversations with legislators on the Iron Range. What if we had wind and solar connected to making steel in the upper Midwest, so it goes from iron in the Iron Range, and we don't have to transport it everywhere. We mine it, the iron, we turn the iron into wind turbines that are in southern Minnesota. There's huge opportunities for efficiency there, maybe powered by green hydrogen, truly green hydrogen in the future.
Sherry, I'm going to have you have the last question here.
You mentioned a lot of different governmental jurisdictions that are involved in solving the climate crisis: state, federal, local, metropolitan council. As citizens and as volunteer activists at the grassroots level, where is it best to put the most of our energy with our congregational members?
Yeah, we have that conversation explicitly within Sierra Club, and I tell people all the time that our job in Minnesotans, most importantly, is at the Minnesota State Legislature. As long as there are, and I don't have to pretend not to have opinions because I work at Sierra Club. All kinds of policies were sitting on a shelf for a decade, and then we got a Democratic trifecta and all kinds of bills passed. As long as that is the case, we need to maximize what we can do at the Minnesota State Legislature. So asking for them to fully implement solar and wind, solar on schools at the state legislature, asking for electric school buses. Have you ever seen those lines outside elementary schools where there's a line of cars, a line of buses? I mean, who benefits from that? I don't want my kids breathing that. School buses is an amazing opportunity for electrification because you don't use them all day long. They charge at night. They charge at night with wind power. They can charge in the middle of the day with solar power. There's so many things we can do at the state legislature, the land use reforms that I've been talking about, insisting that hydrogen growth be green hydrogen powered by solar and wind. There's so many things we can do at the state legislature. Does it matter at the city, county, and Met Council level as well? Absolutely. We're going to be talking about Met Council governance reform at the Minnesota State Legislature. I'll tell you one more thing about the Met Council. In my career, and I've spent a lot of time negotiating with the Met Council, the expansion of our transit system has overwhelmingly happened not due to advocacy by the Met Council, because they don't advocate. They manage a process. The successes we've had have overwhelmingly come because the Met Council was externally pushed by legislators, senators, representatives, by county commissioners, by mayors, by city council members. We deserve a Met Council that will support transit and advocate for it, not just react to the advocacy brought to them externally. But within Minnesota, and I could give you examples at every level, we have to use the trifecta while it exists, because all those policies sat on a shelf for a decade. We can't miss that opportunity.
And we should look to Sierra Club to tell us when we should show up at the Capitol and what we should be, you're going to be pushing out, what we should be looking for and how we should be letting our legislators know and that sort of thing.
And you should know that we are in partnerships. Let me just tell you, as one example, there are lots of partnerships. Our Land Use Coalition, Reform Coalition, Sierra Club, Isaiah, you all know about Isaiah?
We know about Isaiah.
They are one of our partners because they recognize this from a housing affordability crisis, from an equity standpoint, as well as a climate crisis. Move Minnesota. There are multiple organizations who are working on this together, and I'm happy to connect you to that.
That's great. That's great.
Faith-based organizations like Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, they
There you
helped
go.
develop the 5 questions. Happy
Peter
to be connected.
Wagenius. Peter Wagenius, everybody. Thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you. Thank you for great
Wow.
questions. Thank you for talking through things.
We are smarter than we were an hour ago.
All right.
I'm smarter than I was an hour ago. Okay, but wait, you're not done. You're not done. Because you got to go outside and sign a postcard. That's the most important thing, right? You got to take this action outside and sign a postcard. I'll just tell you also that our climate action team is going to meet at 1:30 this afternoon in the library. So if you want to dig in a little further with the FUS climate action team, today's the day. Not the only day, but one of the days. Next week at 12 o'clock, we'll have Paula Maccabee of Water Legacy. And she will be the third part of this really juicy conversation that we've been having. So come back next week and hear part 3. And again, thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone, for the great conversation. Not any more questions right now, but we'll, yeah.
What we're signing out there, is that the same as what was out there last week, though?
No, not the same as last week. Yeah. Contact me for access to the PowerPoint.
And I'll stick around to answer a few more questions, too.
Yep.
It is a new action. Sign the postcard. There is a letter that goes with it. We will be delivering these to the Capitol.
Thank you. What about Larry Kraft? You know about him? Oh, yeah. Okay. He's our ally on most issues. He's fantastic.
Kids, the Roots and Shoots group in St. Louis Park.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they got that most progressive green city plan. And then they took it to the school district and also got it passed.